For this week's videos, I want to focus on two major ideas that are going to serve as a backdrop for basically everything else that we do during the semester. These two ideas are also going to be reoccurring themes that our textbook is going to come back to repeatedly throughout the course. First, we're going to consider the idea that social psychologists actually approach the study of human behavior from a really diverse array of different perspectives. In fact, 4 separate major perspectives. In other words, social psychologists have long, since the beginning of the field, acknowledged that you can try to understand our basic social behavior at very different levels of analysis. So when you're trying to understand why somebody's behaving a certain way, you could consider the fact that they've grown up in or are currently existing in a very particular cultural environment. An environment that might instantiate certain values, certain traditions, and particular social norms that go along with that culture, that community. But in addition to paying attention to cultural influences and the lessons that somebody's learning from their social environment, you could also pay close attention to the fact that human beings are biological creatures. We have certain genes, right, that build out our bodies and our minds in particular ways and not others, and that even our ways of thinking and feeling are constrained to some extent by our genes, by our evolutionary history. Alternatively, you could think about how each person has a really different life history, and just how profoundly shaped we are by some of our early life experiences and our formative relationships. Or if you wanted to take a very different tack, you could focus much more on the here and now, and the fact that people have to actively process and interpret new information in order to successfully navigate their social worlds. And this extreme diversity of what you could focus on as a social psychologist also really links up with the fact that social psychology is in some ways a subfield of psych that overlaps and bridges between lots of other subfields. So, for instance, there's a ton of overlap between some of the questions that social psychology tries to answer about how norms shape behavior, or how there might be cross-cultural differences in social orientations, and some of the questions that a cultural psychologist might ask or answer. There's close connections between lots of areas of social psychology and the same topics that really preoccupy evolutionary psychologists. So if you have any exposure to evolutionary psych, you might know that many of them are very interested in understanding the deep biological roots of how we find and attract mates, when we decide to be aggressive rather than submissive towards another person, how people battle it out for status and dominance, for instance. And these are all kind of key social behaviors as well. A lot of overlap between social psych and developmental psych. So if you've taken developmental psych classes, you might know that a huge part of a kid's development over time is actually their socio-emotional development. Babies flourish and are able to grow and learn in part because of the relationships, the social interactions they have with parents, caregivers, siblings. We develop in a social environment, right? And so there's natural connections with social psych there. And even overlap with cognitive psych. So social psychologists might study some things that look quite cognitive, like how we make split-second perceptual decisions when we first view or encounter other people, or how we interpret and process new information. So given all of this, given these interesting overlaps between social psych and other subdisciplines of psychology, given all the layers of analysis that you could use to try to understand the social world, it's really not surprising that there are some very different grooves that have emerged even within the discipline of social psychology. And we're going to talk about 4 of those: the sociocultural perspective, the evolutionary perspective, the social learning perspective, and the social cognitive perspective. And if you want to call back to what we just talked about, sociocultural is where you're going to get a lot of overlap with what a cultural psychologist might be interested in. Evolutionary, that's a no-brainer. You're going to get a lot of overlap with evo-psych. Social learning might have to do with some of the same ideas and topics a developmental psychologist would be interested in. And social cognitive is where you start to be edging into cognitive psych. So let's start with sociocultural. If you're an adherent of the sociocultural perspective, you're probably going to believe that a big influence on social behavior is a person's immediate cultural environment. You're going to be really interested in trying to understand norms, rules, scripts, and other kinds of expectations that people develop about social behavior. You're going to be really interested in the kinds of messages or values that a culture offers to people. And this is really going to be focusing on the idea that we kind of absorb our cultural environment like a sponge. You almost can't help but absorbing cultural messaging around you, and that messaging isn't going to be super different from one person to another. So sociocultural psychologists are going to be really interested in the social behaviors that tend to be common between people within a culture, but maybe that are going to be varying across cultures. In contrast, an evolutionary psychologist is likely to be really interested in certain behavioral tendencies that are actually shared across all human beings, in all cultures, in all places. And the reason for this is that evolutionary psychologists are really oriented toward understanding the biological constraints and the biological forces shaping our behavior. They are assuming that a lot of how we act as social beings is derived from the fact that we have undergone thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of years of selective pressure that are going to select, they're going to kind of amplify or call for certain kinds of behaviors and really suppress others. And what I mean by that is there could be certain tendencies you might have, be genetically encoded, that would be pretty stupid, pretty maladaptive, and much less likely to allow you to survive and thrive. Like if you had an irresistible urge every time you saw a cliff to run towards it and jump. That tendency, if it was genetic, would probably be stamped out pretty quickly. Stupidly exaggerated example, but you can think of the same things in terms of social behaviors. It's probably a lot smarter to be aggressive towards people who are smaller and weaker than you, and not to be aggressive towards people who are massively bigger and stronger than you. Not saying I endorse that behavior morally, but if you just think about it in terms of which behavior is going to allow someone to survive and thrive. So evolutionary psychologists are going to be really focused on behaviors that seem like they would have been adaptive across a broad range of ancestral environments, how those might have gotten encoded in our genes and persist to the present day. And something that is deeply encoded into our genetic makeup is probably something that you're going to see across a lot of cultures and a lot of different environments, rather than radically varying across time periods or places. So turning to this third major perspective of social learning. Social learning is really interested in an individual person's developmental history. A social learning theorist is going to think about people as extremely impressionable. In other words, that we are sort of sponges throughout our lives. We're picking up on behaviors modeled by our parents, our caregivers, older siblings, maybe your teachers as you get into school, maybe even things you see in the media, like the behavior of celebrity role models. So we're kind of imprinting on the stuff that's around us. But unlike the sociocultural perspective, we're imprinting on some of these influences that might be more unique to us. These sorts of behaviors that would have been rewarded or punished by your parents, or your teachers, or your siblings. Social learning theorists are also a little bit more likely to think about there being certain really formative periods in a person's life that behaviors can get ingrained when you're little, or during these really malleable periods, and that they're likely to stick around for a very long time. Whereas a sociocultural theorist might be more likely to think that anytime you step into a new cultural milieu, you start to absorb the new norms or values of that cultural environment. So turning to our final perspective, social cognitive. And the really key difference here is that social cognitive theorists are much more focused on the here and now. They are less focused on features of the objective environment. So unlike the Evo folks, they're not so focused on exactly what your genetic makeup is. Unlike the social learning theorists, they're a little bit less concerned with exactly how your parents rewarded or punished you for certain behaviors. Instead, they're more focused on what's inside your head. Your subjective and individual interpretation of each environment that you enter. So we're going to try to kind of crawl inside someone's head and examine the process of what they pay attention to, how they're uniquely interpreting their circumstances, and all the criteria that they use to make decisions about what to do. So social cognitive theorists might be interested in even a single person's the diversity in even a single person's behavior from situation to situation, from moment to moment. And so your behavior might change based on what you're paying attention to. Your behavior might change based on having different goals that are active in the moment. All right, so to try to make all of this stuff a little bit more concrete, I'm going to illustrate each of these perspectives and how they would explain the same basic behavior using a stupidly silly example. So I want you to imagine that you are going to a summer backyard cookout, pre-COVID era, or maybe a socially distanced example of this, right? I'm sorry to kind of be poking at a sore spot for folks right now, but imagine you're at a really fun backyard cookout. And you get there, and the host says, make yourself comfortable. There's a cooler in the back. Go and get a drink. So you go to the cooler, you open it up, and you see every kind of soda imaginable. You end up choosing an ice-cold, fizzy Coca-Cola. So why did you do this? Well, if you were a sociocultural psychologist, you might be focused on your cultural milieu, all the cultural environments you've been exposed to throughout your life. And the idea that in American culture, certainly, like many places around the world, Coke has kind of infused itself into the culture. Through billions of dollars of advertising campaigns, the Coca-Cola Corporation has kind of infused our collective consciousness. So we have a cultural understanding of Coke as being a really desirable, really good beverage. So if you were instead a social psychologist taking an evolutionary perspective, you might say, that could all be true, but you're kind of missing the point. You're missing the point that part of what's going on here is your basic biology. The idea that for most of human history, most of our history as a species, we were existing in environments where calories were really scarce, right? So nowadays, drinking lots of Coke is probably not so great for your health. But if you're talking about being on the savannah in a small hunter or gatherer band, anytime you see a high-calorie food source, let's say ripe fruit, or even better yet, some honeycomb, the more densely packed those calories are and the more easily accessible they are, which would be signaled by something being very sweet, oof, that is going to be good for you, right? That is going to mean that you are a couple days farther away from potential starvation, and that's a really good thing. So we evolved to have an extreme preference for sweet food and beverages, right? So our third perspective. If you were a psychologist who took a more social learning perspective, you might think that both of the prior two interpretations are missing an important layer of analysis, and that might be your personal life history. So let's say you grew up in a family where your absolutely beloved grandmother was a die-hard Coke fan. This meant that she gave you Coke as a reward when you were a little kid. This meant that Coke was present at every wonderful family gathering throughout your childhood. And so from your earliest memories, Coke has been strongly associated with positive, good, desirable things. This would then probably have, really ingrained itself on your consciousness, and you'd have a preference for Coke that would extend to the present day. And finally, if you were a psychologist taking a social cognitive perspective, you might focus a lot more on your current present goals and how you're interpreting the situation. So let's say that one thing that all the prior folks missed is that when you walked into this backyard barbecue, you saw that there was an extremely attractive person of your preferred gender who was currently drinking a Coke beverage. And so if you paid attention to that, and if the motive to maybe meet a potential romantic partner was on your mind, you could be extra motivated to find a point of connection with this person, find something that was similar to them, and that might make it a little bit easier to approach them and strike up a conversation. So the last thought I want to leave you with before we round out this video is that these perspectives do not have to be mutually exclusive. So many researchers actually combine layers of analysis to try to understand social behavior. You could be an evolutionary theorist who looks at the fact that for most people, there's a strong motive to create social connections or find romantic partners, and you might fuse that with the knowledge that someone can walk into a situation and either be highly attuned to information that they're getting about someone else being available or romantically appealing, or maybe have something else on their mind, have other goals that are active, and so pay less attention to that information. And that would be more of a social cognitive perspective. So these are not mutually exclusive. They can be used kind of harmoniously to explain behavior. All right, thanks folks.